out loud or I forget. Okay.
So I know you heard that, Kathy. I came by the house and through the window, Alton just was, I didn't want to interrupt him. That's why I left something at the door. I was there, but he was going back and I just thought, he would have to interrupt what he's doing. So I'm sorry that I didn't go in, but I just didn't feel like I wanted to do that to him. So I didn't make that up. I really did see him this week. You just didn't see me.
Well, you left evidence, so
I did. I left evidence at the
Sort of
door.
like Santa Claus, huh? We are starting a new study, and we're starting the study of Elijah. And we just finished the study of Jonah, and Jonah was a prophet. And as you remember, we learned that there are 12 minor prophet books, and the only reason they're considered minor, it wasn't that Jonah was a minor prophet. It was that his book was only 48 verses long. And there were 4 major prophets, and they have very long books. And now we come to Elijah, and Elijah doesn't have a book at all. And yet, if you probably surveyed people and put a list of prophets and people who are active Bible readers and not, most people have heard of Elijah, and they would know he was a prophet. So he's like one of the most important prophets, and he doesn't have a book. The other thing that I noted, oh, there's Naya, there's Carol's daughter. One of the most things I noted is when we studied Jonah, we talked about it was the only book of a prophet that wasn't about prophecies. It was more about the life of Jonah. And as I told Scott this morning when we were talking, when we start studying Elijah, Elijah does make a prophecy, but once again, it's more about the book, about the life of Elijah. Yes?
There's a lot of that, yeah.
Yeah. So, and when, I like to do when, where, how. So Elijah was born in 900 BC. So to put that in perspective, after studying Jonah, he's 150 years before Jonah. Okay. So that is where we are. Elijah appears 23 times in the Bible, in 23 different times, seven of them in the Old Testament and 16 in the New Testament. So once again, we talk about there's some churches now that are New Testament churches, or people that say they just read the New Testament. Think about that. If you just read the New Testament and you come upon Elijah 16 times, you have no idea what they're talking about because it's in the Old Testament. So I just thought that 7 times in the Old Testament and 16 times in the New Testament. And the next thing I want to do is share the Bible Project thing, but do you want to say?
Well, yeah, I want to talk for a minute
Yeah.
because we say, just about every time we start one of these Old Testament studies, it's hard to really understand what's going on if you don't know some of the history, if you don't have the context for it. What was that?
Oh, I was turning off.
Oh, I thought you were showing me. Okay. And it's not because we want to teach a history class, but if you don't understand what's going on and what's going on in the world at this time, you miss a lot. You don't understand the importance. It's just a sort of a flat story. And if you do know some of the history and the context, and you realize, oh, hey, this was a big deal. And I get what's going on. And I also see a lot of the same things going on in my world. And I can take this and apply it now. I can see why this would be important to me today. And so we don't want to teach a history class, but I feel like it's just, it's our job to go back and deal with some of this context. And Elijah is a great example of that. What's happening in the world, what's happening within Israel, there's Terry, is sort of monumental. It's a really big deal. So if you can bear with us, we're going to show this Bible project. They do, it's cartoony, but it's not like a kid's cartoon. They do a really good job, and the guy's very solid with, he's a PhD Hebrew guy, but he gets it right a lot. But this story of Elijah is in the book of Kings. The Jews had, a chronicle of all the kings. And so this is about actually the books of Kings, but I think it's.
And so some of the things to listen, it's 8 or 9 minutes long. So I want you to listen for a couple of things. We've studied David when we studied the Psalms. So David is in there. Solomon, when we studied Ecclesiastes, it starts off with telling you how Solomon plays a role in this. So it puts a lot of the things that we have just studied together. And I'm going to let you play with
Okay,
this.
and I guess it's probably one last thing that's worth noting. A lot of people are just not aware that Israel, the people of Israel, wanted a king. You know, all the cool nations have kings, and we want a king, and they think it'll make us more powerful. It'll be, it'll settle everything. He'll just be able to lay down the law, and they want a king. And God says through prophets, through his people, you don't want a king. I don't want you to have a king. They were never intended to live that way. I don't think we're intended to live that way, okay? But they were never intended to live that way, and they just pressed and pressed. And finally he says, okay, you know what, I'm going to give you a king. You aren't going to like it, but you're going to get a king. And we get Saul, and but David is sort of the pinnacle, and it goes down. But a couple of kings after David, this king that was supposed to solve everything instead splits everything. Israel, the nation, splits. There's a northern and a southern kingdom. They literally split in two. They were always meant to be one people, and they ruined it. And they did it pretty quick through this idea of having kings. So these books of Kings is going to explain some things, but I think that's a good piece to keep in mind.
Make sure we do the
Sound?
sound. Yeah.
So
Where is it?
they did another update. So I understand some people said,
Who can share? Okay, that's just giving.
they said it looked different logging on this morning. Well, it looked different to me
Here,
too.
share screen.
And so there's nothing we can do about it. We come into a new world all the time. So share screen and
Yeah.
Bible Project and share sound. I think that's it.
Okay, and if someone, okay. Jack, and when it starts, if you can give us a thumbs up if you can hear.
The books of 1st and 2nd Kings. Although they're two separate books in our Bibles, they were originally written as one book telling a unified story that continues on from the book of Samuel that came before it. So David has unified the tribes of Israel into a kingdom, and God promised that from his line would come a messianic king who would establish God's kingdom over the nations and fulfill the promises made to Abraham. So the book of Kings tells the story of the long line of kings that came after David, and none of them lived up to that promise. In fact, they run the nation of Israel right into the ground. The book is designed to have 5 main movements. The story begins and ends focus on Jerusalem, first with Solomon's reign and the construction of the temple, and then in this last section ending with Jerusalem's destruction and Israel's exile to Babylon. And the story leading up to this tragedy is what makes up the center 3 sections, which explain how Israel split into 2 rival kingdoms, how God tried to prevent the corruption of Israel by sending the prophets, and how exile became the unavoidable consequence of Israel's sin. The book opens with 2 chapters about the kingdom passing from the aging David to his son Solomon. And David's final words to Solomon, they're very similar to those of Moses and Joshua and Samuel to the people. It's a call to remain faithful to the commands of the covenant and to give allegiance to the God of Israel alone. But David's words ring somewhat hollow here, because David and Solomon then go on to conspire how they're going to consolidate this new kingdom through a whole series of political assassinations. It's not off to a great start. Solomon's brightest moment comes when he asks God for wisdom to lead Israel, and he even completes David's dream to make a temple for the God of Israel. Here the story actually stops and describes the design of this temple in detail, just like the tabernacle design in the Torah. There's all these gold and jewels and depictions of angels and fruit trees. It's all symbolism echoing back to the Garden of Eden. It's the place where heaven and earth meet, where God's presence dwells with his people. But no sooner does Solomon finish finish the temple that he makes some really horrible choices and the kingdom falls apart. He starts marrying the daughters of other kings, hundreds of them, for political alliances. And then he adopts their gods and introduces the worship of those gods into Israel. Solomon then accumulates huge amounts of wealth. He builds a huge army. He even institutes slave labor for all of his building projects. Now, if you go back to the Torah and look at God's guidelines for Israel's kings in Deuteronomy 17, Solomon is breaking every one. So by the time that he dies, Solomon resembles Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, more than he does his father David. The next section of the book opens with Solomon's son, Rehoboam, acting just like his father. It's a very sad story of greed and lust for power. He tries to increase taxes for slave labor. And under the leadership of Jeroboam, the northern tribes reject this, they rebel and secede, and form their own rival kingdom. And so now in the story, you have the southern kingdom, Judah, centered in Jerusalem with kings from the line of David, and now this new northern kingdom called Israel, whose capital will be Samaria eventually. Jeroboam also goes on to build 2 new temples to compete with Solomon's temple in the south. He puts a golden calf in each one to represent the God of Israel. The connection to Exodus 32 and the golden calf, it's all quite explicit. From this point on, the story goes back and forth from north to south, tracing the fate of both kingdoms. Each one had about 20 successive kings, and as the author introduces each king, he evaluates their reign by a few criteria. Did they worship the God of Israel alone, or did they promote the worship of other gods? Did they deal with idolatry among the people? And did they remain faithful to the covenant like David, or do they become corrupt and unjust? And according to these criteria, the author finds no good kings in northern Israel, 0 for 20. And then in southern Judah, only 8 out of 20 get a positive rating, which connects to another huge purpose in this book, and that's to introduce the role of the prophets, key figures in Israel's history. So in the Bible, prophets were not fortune tellers. Rather, they spoke on behalf of the God of Israel, and they played the role of covenant watchdogs, which means they called out idolatry and injustice among the kings and the people. They were constantly reminding Israel of their calling to be a light to the nations, that they should obey the commands of the Torah, and so the prophets challenged Israel to repent and follow their God. In these center sections for each king, God then raises up prophets to hold them accountable. And the most prominent prophets are the northern ones, Elijah and his disciple Elisha, right here in the center of the book. Elijah was a wild man of a prophet living out in the desert, and his arch nemesis was the northern king Ahab and his Canaanite wife Jezebel. Together, these two had instituted the worship of the Canaanite god Baal over Israel. And so in a famous story, Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal to a contest to see which god was real. So they both build altars and pray to their gods, but only the God of Israel answers with fire. After this, Ahab uses his royal power to murder an Israelite farmer and then steal his family's vineyard. And Elijah again confronts Ahab's injustice, and he announces the downfall of his house. Elijah eventually passes the mantle of his prophetic leadership to a young disciple named Elisha, who asks for 2 times the authority of Elijah. And what's fascinating here is how the author, he's recounted 7 miraculous feats for Elijah, and then he offers stories of 14 acts of power from Elijah. Both prophets were clearly remarkable men, and they played the same role, confronting Israel's kings for idolatry and injustice. And ultimately, they were unsuccessful in turning Israel back from apostasy. In the next section, the northern kingdom is rocked by a bloody revolution started by a king named Jehu, who destroys Ahab's family. And although Jehu was at first commissioned by God, his violence just gets out of control, and it creates the spiral of political assassinations and rebellions from which Israel never recovered. Coup follows coup after Jehu, and each king follows other gods, allows horrible injustice. It all leads up to 2 Kings chapter 17. The big bad empire of Assyria swoops down and takes out the northern kingdom altogether. In the capital city of Samaria, it's conquered, and the Israelites are exiled and scattered throughout the ancient world. Now, chapter 17 is key. The author stops the story and offers this prophetic reflection on what's just happened. He blames the downfall of the northern kingdom on the idolatry and covenant unfaithfulness of Israel and its kings. And so, God has allowed them to face the consequences of their decisions. divisions. The final movement of the book tells the story of the lone southern kingdom. And here we meet some very heroic kings, like Hezekiah, who trusts God when the armies of Assyria come knocking on Jerusalem's door, or Josiah, who discovers this lost scroll of the Torah in the temple. So he starts reading it, he's convicted, and he institutes religious reforms to remove idolatry and Canaanite influences from the land. But Judah is just too far gone. The king, right in between these two, Manasseh, he's the worst by far. So he not only introduces the worship of idol statues into the Jerusalem temple, he also institutes child sacrifice. And so God sends prophets to say, the time is up. Israel has reached the point of no return. The final chapters tell the story of the Babylonian Empire coming to invade Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and carry the people and the royal line of David off into exile. And so the story ends leaving us wondering, is God done with Israel? Is he done with the line of David? Well, the final paragraph zooms about 40 years forward into the exile, and it tells a very odd story. It's about Jehoiakim, a descendant from David, who would have been king if he was back in Jerusalem. And the king of Babylon releases him from prison and invites him to eat at the royal table for the rest of his life, and the book ends. So it's not much, but it's a story that gives a glimmer of hope that God has not abandoned the line of David. So the question now is, how is God going to fulfill his promises to Abraham, to David? How is he going to bless the nations and bring the Messianic kingdom? And to answer those questions, you have to read on into the wisdom and the prophetic books. But for now, that's the Book of Kings.
Mary, can I just ask, can we just Google Bible Project?
Bible Project,
That's
and
amazing.
it's one of those things, we've listened to it 3 or 4 times, and every time you listen to it, you pick up something different. But to me, it puts together everything we've learned too, so they're not just separate pieces.
Yep.
So today is a lot of understanding where we are. We're going to talk about 2 characters in this early section. So we're starting in 1 Kings, and we're actually, I said chapter 17, and we're going to go back a little bit and read the end of 16. But we're going to address two people, and that's Elijah and Ahab. Now, Ahab was the king of Israel, the northern kingdom that was split in 2. Do we want to show the map real quick, or do we want to do the map after?
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay, so this is a map. So this is important. You saw that in the video. So this was all Israel, and then you heard that one of the, this is like really annoying how they have this one.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, anyhow, so they split the kingdom, and we're talking about Israel and Judah. And the king in Israel at this time is Ahab. And Ahab was the 7th king in the northern kingdom. And you heard that there ends up being 20 of them. He reigns a long time. He reigns for 22 years. So during the entire story of Elijah, it's going to be King Ahab in the north. And as you saw in that thing, that scorecard, all the kings on the north were bad. What's the line that they use over and over again? If you're reading Kings, you get sort of lulled
And
by
he
it.
did evil in the sight of the Lord.
He did evil in the sight of the Lord. Ahab, we will learn, did lots of evil in the sight of the Lord. He was like
It says that Ahab was the worst of all of them. He was worse than all the others put together.
What else, other things you want to point out?
Real quick, just because I think it may later, sometime it may help you, but if you look at this map, the green area is the northern kingdom. The orange area is the southern kingdom. And when they split, but you see the Jericho, I'm running the cursor, I hope you can see it, the Jericho, the Jordan River. Over here on the east side of the Jordan, it is the country of Jordan now, but this was Ammonites. These were pagan people, and they lived over here. The people of Israel lived here after they left Egypt for a long time. And when it's time to go to the promised land, they've got to cross the Jordan. But there were 2 tribes that said, we kind of like it over here. Would it be okay if we took our promised our inheritance over on this side. What we'll do, we'll go help you fight. We'll take this promised land, we'll go help you. But when it's all said and done, if it's all the same to you, we'll come back here. And those two tribes basically just faded out of existence. They just sort of blended into the Ammonite countryside. And over a period of time, we just don't hear about them anymore. So this whole section over here on the east side is that country where they live. But the place where Elijah comes from is right about where this town Kamon is. It's right in here. That's where Gilead was. And so he comes from the east side of the Jordan. Later on, they began to treat anything east of the Jordan as a horrible place with horrible people. But it wasn't always that way.
So Samaria, you're going to hear Samaria, that's where King Ahab lives. That's the capital of Israel, the northern kingdom. And Jerusalem is the capital of the southern kingdom. Do you want to talk about before I start on, yeah.
Would you, I'm confused about Samaria is the capital, did you say?
Samaria is a town and the northern kingdom makes that
So was it the whole, all of Israel was not Samaria at one time?
no, never. I mean, so Samaria is a region also, and it gets confusing. They recycle names a lot. So Samaria is a region in the time of Jesus, but here Samaria is a town, and it's where the northern kingdom had their capital, and they built their own rival temple to rival Jerusalem's temple. But yeah, it's a town. And Jericho, I might as well, because it comes up in this story. Right here, if you can see the cursor, is Jericho. This is the Dead Sea. Up here's the Sea of Galilee. Right up above the Dead Sea. When Israel first came into the promised land.
So this is 40 years with Moses in the desert, and now it's finally time to get the promise God made that the Jews were going to get the promised land.
And the first place they come across is right here where Jericho is. And it's going to come up in this story, but Jericho is a walled city, and it has especially formidable walls, and they were afraid of it. And we learned through some other stories that the people of Jericho, the people of the region, know all about these followers of Yahweh, and they're scared of them. But the people of Israel mostly are scared to try and go take this walled city. And this is going to come up, but this is where it is, just north of the Dead Sea, and they come across, and the first place they hit is Jericho. So there's some perspective on that.
Okay, so I'm going to start with 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 29. In the 38th year of Asa's reign over Judah, Ahab, son of Obri, became king of Israel, and he reigned in Samaria 22 years. However, Ahab, son of Obri, did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. And as if it were not enough for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, he even married Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of Sidonians. And he then proceeded to serve and worship Baal. First, Ahab set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he had built in Samaria. Then he set up an Asherah pole. Thus Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel before him. In Ahab's day, Hiel, the Bethelite, rebuilt Jericho. At the cost of Abiram, his firstborn, he laid its foundation, and at the cost of Segum, his youngest, he set up its gates, according to the word of the Lord had spoken through Joshua, son of Nun. Wow.
I forgot it comes up in this
Right away.
week. Yeah, it comes up right away. So they go to take this walled city. And a lot of you know the story or the songs.
So
and
we're
everything.
back with Moses.
We're back when they first come into the promised land. Not Moses, because he didn't get to come.
Right.
But
Joshua.
right after that, Joshua leads them. But they're afraid. And God tells him, you go there, you blow your trumpets, you march around it 7 times, and the walls come down. And there are people who like to say, well, they set up a harmonic and it made a resonance and it caused the thing. The walls fell down. Back in the early days before the kings, and even at the beginning when Saul is king, when they would go to battle, Israel, the king would decide we're going to battle. And the king is supposed to go to the high priest and seek God's blessing. And if God says, no, don't do this, they're supposed to not do it. And when they do that, the soldiers are allowed to loot. I know you're wondering why I'm telling you this, but but the soldiers are allowed to take a share of all the spoils. The king takes a big share because you have to run a country. But there are times where God says, I want you to go to this place and fight this battle, and it's mine. There's a reason for it, and I'm sending you. And when that happened, they were not supposed to take anything. I mean, they're not supposed to pick up anything, because there's a tendency for humans to start saying, look how powerful we are. And these certain battles, God says, this is mine. And they were supposed, and Saul, the very first king, gets in trouble for that. He goes out, he doesn't ask for permission, and he brings back cattle. And the prophet comes and says, what are you doing? And he says, I was going to sacrifice these to Yahweh. The people told me, and I couldn't resist. I would have looked bad. So it starts with Saul, the very first king, breaking this. But what you see with Jericho is this is one of those places that God says, you go here. This is your first big battle. You're going to see a miracle from me. This is my battle. This is my victory. And what did they do? They did what they were told, and they see this miraculous victory. But I'm trying to think of who it was Joshua who makes this pronouncement. And he says, this place shall never be rebuilt.
So Jericho was never supposed to be rebuilt after they walked around 7 times and the walls fell down.
It
Never.
winds up supposed to be sort of a monument, the rubble of this place, so that they never forget. And he says, this place must never be rebuilt. And if it does, laying the foundation will come at the cost of the person's firstborn. And putting up the walls will come at the cost of the second-born son. And this is like a prophecy, because under Ahab, one of Ahab's boys, Ahab loves everything pagan. He does. He just loves, he goes 180 degrees. If it's wrong, that's what I want to do. If it's against Yahweh, that's what he's going to do. And he has one of his people go and rebuild Jericho. Why would you want to rebuild this city? Why would you want that? If you're a good Jew, you wouldn't. But the guy goes, and sure enough, as he's laying the foundation, his firstborn child dies. And as he's putting up walls, his secondborn, and the prophecy is there. And if you think that that's mean or cruel or whatever, I don't know what to tell you. I would not mess with this kind of a prophecy. But it is, it was foretold, and they do it, and it comes out exactly like that.
But this is an example of a paragraph. If you were just reading the Bible, you just read this verse, you wouldn't know. You wouldn't know what was going on.
The big point is, as I said, Ahab loves everything pagan. He just turns away. He puts golden calves, in temples. And the Asherah pole is a fertility goddess. It's a monument that they build in different places, and they're really not supposed to be building these. And sometimes they build them in secret. Well, Ahab just puts it right out there in front of everybody. This is him. He gets people to stop reading Torah, reading the scriptures. He just basically says this northern kingdom no longer worships Yahweh. And Jezebel,
So the woman he decides to marry.
Most of us have heard someone, at least back when we used to say anything was wrong, called a Jezebel. These are bad women. And the Baal that we talk about, the worship Baal, it's actually, Baal means owner. And these people, there are multiple gods under that heading of Baal. We do see one of those things we just read said he set up worship of the Baals. There are multiples, but this woman he marries, her father up sort of northwest is king and high priest of one of these Baal worship cults. He's a priest king. She's his daughter. They're sort of known for having temple prostitutes, and it's speculated that perhaps Jezebel was chief among those, but she knows how to influence men, and Ahab loves it. And Ahab marries this pagan, daughter of the high priest of one of the big Baals, and everything she tells him, I don't know that she has to tell him. He just loves doing stuff that she loves. And he becomes the worst. He turns Israel totally away from Yahweh. That's and so in the northern kingdom, there is no one. And there really is, and that's what we're going to learn. But the picture you get is that there is no one worshiping Yahweh anymore. And that's when Elijah, that's what he's sent into, this one guy. And he shows up with judgment, with condemnation. These prophets come in to tell kings, you've turned away from Yahweh. You have to repent. You have to turn around. And you can imagine how popular that is anytime. But for Ahab, who has totally embraced, he's Darth Vader. I mean, he's the dark side. And to be told, you know what, God has seen what you're doing and you're being judged. They don't like it. Nobody likes to hear that. So that's where we come. That's the point where Elijah enters the picture.
I'm gonna go down a little side trail here. Remember when you, in your Bible, when you read and it says, and different translations are different, but when it says the Lord in the Berean Bible, if you have that, they capitalize all the letters. That is Yahweh. That is the one true God. And I actually listened to a sermon this week, and this minister said, I am not saying anybody has to do this, but it's a good reminder. He says, you know what, when I pray, I try to say Lord or Yahweh rather than God. And he says, God is a title, not a name. And as for what it does for us is that, we have a lot of other gods too. We always talk about these people who have pagan gods, but we have the God of money, we have the God of success, we have the God of our family, our spouse, whatever our
whatever we put in front of Yahweh.
Yeah, and anyhow, this minister says, I don't always do it, but when you pray, if you say, dear Lord, and you're thinking all capital letters, it is the recognition that it is the one true God.
Do you remember me telling you about names in the Bible, in the Old Testament? Anytime you see El, almost anytime, nearly every time, a name has El in it. Ezekiel, Gabriel, the El is God. So that name has something to do with God. And anytime you see Jah, Jah, or Yah, or IAH, which is still Yah, that usually, almost always, is Yahweh. Elijah's name is El-Yah. It says, Yahweh is my God, or my God is Yahweh. That's what his name means. And I always wonder about these things. Were they really named Shlomo, and later on they get this nickname, they get the thing, because you see what's happened is Yahweh is no longer who they recognize as their God. And in comes a guy whose name is, my God is Yahweh. I don't know what order they happen in, but it's not an accident.
If we go to the birthplace of Elijah,
Yes.
at that time, that part of the country had already turned.
Well,
So I'm interested in the name of whoever named him at that time, because a couple more.
Well, that's
years
what you
later,
said ahead of
people
time, that
said-
it's not
well,
everybody.
it's not everybody. We're actually going to see that very, clearly displayed, that he's not the only one. We speak in generalities a lot, and Elijah sort of learns that's maybe not the best thing to do. The point is that the people, by and large, have been led astray by Ahab, and the ones who haven't, the ones who still worship Yahweh, are mostly afraid. They mostly don't do it real publicly out of fear. So who named him? And then you also have to remember where he came from is over on the other side of the Jordan. They're not as, this is still a big place. And so it may well be that Gilead has more people who openly worship Yahweh. But if I need to put it into modern terms, I can. You see a lot of the same things going on in our society, and you see people more and more afraid to say anything about God in public because they're going to get that face, right? That's how the behaviors get changed. Even if we go home and pray, we don't tell people about it.
But that's one of the points of the story, is you've got to speak up and stand up for your faith.
That's true.
Very true.
I mean, you can stray a little bit, maybe and get back, but you've got to draw that line.
Well, you're right. Let's go. We're going to see it in action.
So, 1 Kings chapter 17. Now Elijah the Tishbite, who was among the settlers of Gilead, said to Ahab, as surely as the Lord lives, the God of Israel, before whom I stand, there'll be neither dew nor rain in these days, except at my word.
So Elijah is a Tishbite. There's a place called Tishbe, right? And it's in that area of Gilead. Nobody knows where it is. Nobody knows. I mean, I've studied and studied and studied, and there are a bunch of people who speak very, convincingly. Nobody knows exactly where Tishbe is. It ceased to exist, but we know he's from there, and it's in that Gilead region. But he shows up, and we don't know anything about him. When you think about it, we don't really even know the place anymore, except the region. But we don't know anything about his family. We don't know what he was, what he did. He just appears on the scene, and he's talking in front of the king, and he's part of the northern kingdom. So he's talking to his king, and he comes in and he says, as surely as Yahweh lives. In other words, I'm telling you, this is fact. Yahweh lives, and as surely as he lives, what I'm telling you is true. But he says, as surely as the Lord lives, Yahweh, the God of Israel, before whom I stand. He's telling the king, I worship Yahweh. I stand before, and you should too. It's a reminder in terms of as surely as Yahweh lives, and he is the Lord of Israel, whether you recognize him or not. This is a big, bold entrance. Elijah is never afraid. And I say that he is later on, but he's bold, and he's getting the king told in his intro, right?
And Ahab probably, has Yahweh among many, but Yahweh is not his primary God.
Yeah, well, he from what we can understand, he may not recognize Yahweh at all anymore. But what he tells him is there will be neither rain or dew in this land for years. And it's not going to happen until I deliver the message, right? And it reads like he's saying, this is all me, but he's already made it clear he serves Yahweh.
He's a prophet.
And he's a prophet, and he's delivering a message. So he says, you're not going to see any rain or even dew. You're going to have a drought like you've never seen before for years, and it's not going to relent until you hear it from me. And that becomes sort of a prophecy.
It doesn't say how this goes for Elijah or what Ahab's reaction is, but we can imagine that Ahab is not happy with this work.
Well, no, and we're told later that Ahab's angry and has been out looking for him.
Yeah.
It's not really spelled out. We should be smart enough to sort of surmise, but we're actually told later, Ahab got angry and went out looking for him. So, yeah, this is not a popular message.
So is Ahab aware of the Moses Exodus?
Sure.
Sure.
So, I mean, now he's being told directly.
Well, it's been a long
That,
time.
Or I'm gonna put a drop on you that you won't.
Sure. And you got to remember that they just left Egypt, and Moses goes to get the commandments and then build a golden calf, the same golden calf, the same sort of Canaanite, pagan idol. This is nothing new, but yeah, he is familiar with the stories of judgment from God. But how do we get? He's not going to do anything. Okay.
Okay, so verse 2, then a revelation from the Lord came to Elijah, leave here, turn eastward, and hide yourself by the brook of Cherith, east of the Jordan, and you are to drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there. So Elijah did what the Lord had told him, and he went and lived by the brook of Cherith, east of the Jordan. The ravens would bring him bread and meat in the morning and evening, and he would drink from the brook. Sometime later, however, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land.
So after he delivers this message, we see him being told, go and hide. So you got a pretty good idea that Ahab is not pleased. I mean, we're not just guessing. We have enough clues. He's told, go and hide. And I know a lot of people want to question this and say, well, if you serve a great God, why doesn't he just say, stay where you are, I'll zap this guy for you? I mean, that's the way it's, why would he have to go hide if he's this wonderful prophet? And I'm going to tell you, we'll see by the end of this, I will hope to convince you that there are things that need to play out. It's not time yet for that. And Ahab, left alone, will kill him. I mean, he will kill Elijah. They're known for killing prophets, but he will. And so what God says is, go to this place and hide out for a while. Elijah gets sent to a place where he is absolutely forced to live by faith. I mean, he depends on God for everything. But if you think this idea of it's not time yet for all this other stuff, there are things that have to play out. Isn't that the same thing that happens with Jesus? He says, it's not my time yet. He doesn't get into big conflict with these people. He may enrage the Pharisees, but he doesn't get into a conflict because it's not his time yet. When it is his time, he makes a beeline for Jerusalem and things play out. And he is in fact killed, right? He sacrifices himself. So that's all that's going on here. This is not out of character for Elijah to be told, go and hide. And the ravens bring in food.
There's a lot of talk about that.
Right, yeah, there is. And it's an odd thing. Ravens are not crows, they're carrion eaters. They're bringing him food. It's just an odd thing to think about. Ravens are not eligible to be food. They're unclean animals. And don't you think it's a little bit odd that God has these unclean animals bring food to a good Jew? We see this all the time. These rigid rules that we think of. You can't eat this. And here Peter gets his vision that says, if God made it, eat it, right? It's the same thing. This had to have been one of those things where a good Jewish man would say, well, no, I'm not supposed to eat anything that this unclean bird has touched. And yet here's the instruction. So while he's waiting for the next step in this, he is being forced to live by faith and just do what he's told. You know my expression, never mind if the horse goes blind, just load the wagon, right? Just do it. And that's what he does. And then the brook dries up because, well, there's no rain. But now it's time, the things that have been prepared, it's time for you to move to the next stage.
So going back to Jonah for a second, his response to God was different than Jonah. Jonah, God told Jonah to do something, and he went the other direction. I mean, here's Elijah told to do this and, sit by this, drink out of a brook and be fed by ravens. And Elijah says, okay. Then when I'm on verse 8, then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, get up and go to Zarephath of Sidon, and stay there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you.
We just got to stop there.
Yeah.
That'll probably take us to the end of the day. His next step is telling him, get up and go to this region. And if you don't understand what the region is, you don't get, this is pagan land.
It's not good.
Tyre and Sidon, there's a woman when Jesus goes up into Gentile territory from Tyre and Sidon. They're up northwest along the coast, but they're up in pure pagan land. We have been raised on this idea that the Jews were God's chosen people without understanding what that means. They were chosen to be the lineage where Messiah comes from, where salvation comes from. But the idea that God chooses a people and doesn't have anything to do with the rest of them just gets blown up all through the scriptures. And nearly every study, we see one of these cases where we tell you, oh, look, he sends this, Jewish prophet up into Tyre and Sidon
Pagan
as
land.
pagan land in his next step. The Jewish leadership, the people get to the point that later on, if a Jew visits, if they go outside of Israel into one of these regions, when you come back, you take your sandals off and you wipe the dust. You don't even want to carry any of this pagan dust back into the holy land of Israel with you. And what you see here is that was never the way it was intended. That was never God's intent. And he sends the prophet up into Tyre and Sidon. And what Mary said a while ago, we saw Jonah, he's told to go to a place like this. And Jonah turns around and heads the other way. Elijah doesn't question, he just goes.
One more thing, he says, behold, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you. Now, widows in this time were like starving to death. I mean, it was not good to be a widow to begin with. You think to yourself, here's this good Jew who's a prophet, who's following God, and God tells them, first of all, you've been eating from a raven, an unclean bird. Now I've got another plan for you. You're going to go to pagan land, and I'm going to have a widow take care of you.
We've got a son that, the wayward one that's in another self-destruct mode, right?
Yeah, so pray for
And
him.
he's quit his job. He was gonna hop a bus to Cleveland or something because he thinks that's a good place to be homeless. It would be like being told, I want you to go to San Antonio and let Peter provide for you. No, I'm not gonna do it. A widow is gonna provide for me, right? In a time where there's drought and famine, and the widows are the lowest on the social order because there's no one to provide for them most of the time. They have a problem. And I'm not saying it's good. I'm telling you that's how it is. And he says, I want you to go up into this pagan country. And oh, by the way, I've appointed a widow to look after your needs, to give you a place. And it has got to be a test of faith to say, instead of doing like Jonah, to actually say, okay, if you say so, that's what I'm going to do.
Do you want me to stop there? Or do you want me to read the next paragraph?
See if we got a paragraph in this.
Okay, so Elijah got up and went to Zarephath. When he arrived at the city gate, there was a widow gathering sticks. Elijah called to her and said, please bring me a little water in a cup so that I may drink. And as she was going to get it, he called to her and said, please bring me a piece of bread. But she replied, as surely as the Lord your God lives, I have no bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. Look, I'm gathering a couple of sticks to take home and prepare a meal for myself and my son so that we may eat it and die.
It's kind of dire circumstances. Sure enough, there's a widow and he asked her for a cup of water. And you have to see in this the woman at the well, when Jesus goes, and it's one of these in
Samaria.
it's in Samaria, and he asked her for water. And she knows who he is. You notice this woman says, as surely as Yahweh, your God lives, she acknowledges Yahweh. But here's what's happened is that he has sent his prophet into a place, and we'll see next week that he actually brings knowledge of Yahweh to a place. And we don't know what effect this had years later as people, as Jesus gets there, but there's a knowledge. But she says, where the woman at the well tells Jesus, I don't want to give you any water. Your people and my people don't get along. That's not the case here. She gives him water, and he says, how about some bread? He knows what's going on here. And she says, I'm telling you, all I have is like a handful of grain and a jar, a little bit of oil in it. And I'm about to make our last pita, our unleavened bread. And we're going to eat our last meal, and then we're going to die. Me and my son, we have nothing left to eat. This is the person God has appointed to provide for him while he's across the border, while he's in sort of exile. This is a test of faith. But Elijah, it does have faith, and he's not concerned by it. As we will see next week, there's a plan for this. But you see in these things, these long plans. And later we see that, as I said, Israel is they're the chosen people because they're part of a long plan, but it's not to the exclusion of the other people. It was never that. By all rights, he shouldn't even have been there. But God says, you know what, you go and you're going to take this knowledge of me to this place, and things will come out of it. Just go and do.
I'm going to end with one last verse in James. So I said, he appears, Elijah, the whole story of Elijah appears 17 times in the New Testament. And we'll get to this later, but I just want to remind us that Elijah was still a man, okay? And James is talking about prayer, and he's telling people how to pray. And he says, therefore, confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous man has great power to prevail. Elijah was a man just like us. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3.5 years. Again, he prayed, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth yielded its crops.
You will see through all of these, there are times where there is judgment. There are times where there is consequence. And if not judgment, then a consequence for actions. But mostly you see that a lot of these miracles, and like the rain, it has the intended purpose. And we're going to see that the people of Israel see the power of God through this. It sets up a time where things are very hard, and then they get to see God at work, and they go, oh, we've been wrong. We turned away. It has a purpose. It's not just for the purpose of making people's lives miserable. Anything else? We have these accounts of things that go beyond our experience, things that are sometimes hard. We look at someone being fed by ravens, and we don't really understand that. I mean, we can nod our head and say that we do, but we struggle with those things. And we overlook your hand in this world, your hand in our lives, the same way. We overlook it, and we think if only we had some big display like this, well, then we could believe it all. It's our faith that I ask you for to bolster, to understand, and the eyes to look around and see your hand at work in this place. Without that, it's a dark world, and we know that you bring light. Open our eyes, as always, our hearts. Help our faith. In Jesus' name, amen.
You guys can unmute yourself, and if you didn't hear early on, if you guys could send a happy birthday wish to Joyce, and if you guys here could sign one of the cards Joyce turned 90 yesterday and has hurt her back very badly. So, and if it's easier for you just to email me it, and I will cut and paste those good wishes and put them into a card for Joyce.
I bet they watch this. Everybody want to just say happy birthday, Joyce?
Happy birthday, Joyce. Happy birthday.
You stop recording.
Wilson.
Happy birthday, Joyce.
Bye-bye.
There's CT.
I'll stop